Fujifilm recipes are one of the biggest reasons that a lot of people pick up a Fujifilm camera. Basically, they're custom settings that you can put into your camera to produce a variety of different looks within the camera, meaning you can get some really unique colors from your images without any editing necessary. From white balance to saturation, contrast, grain, and more, it's all customizable within easy to understand menus. And best of all, it saves a ton of time from when you take the photo to when you share the photo. Welcome back to the channel. I'm Chris Hagen, a video producer and photographer in Portland, Oregon. And like many others, the recipes you've probably heard so much about are one of the main reasons that I was drawn into the X100VI and all of the hype, which I recently did a very in-depth review on that you should check out after this video. Anyway, I've done my share of experimenting with different recipes for different looks, and I'm gonna share the ones that I use most. And I think it's really a good mix of recipes. Some work best on sunny days, others work on the gray winter days that we get a lot of here in Portland, and some are just really versatile and work well in just about any situation. But first, and very important, a few quick notes about the way Fujifilm settings work and how I use these different recipes. First of all, while these recipes can give you a lot of different looks within your JPEG straight out of the camera to create unique images without editing, it's nice to have the raw file as a backup just in case you want to change the look later. For example, if you've really pushed the color or tint heavily in one direction or added a lot of grain, but also want a cleaner or normal white balance version of the image later, you'll want to have that raw file to correct yourself down the road. And that brings me to my next point. While most settings are not baked into the raw image like they are the JPEG, white balance is. So my recommendation, if you don't want to give yourself extra work to do in post for a photo that you know you'll end up editing, it's probably a good idea to have one recipe that's some form of auto white balance without too much of a shift in tint. The X100VI allows me to save 7 different custom profiles, technically 8 with the top profile that's labeled nothing selected. And that's where I keep my default profile that I'll use indoors or anywhere with funky lighting or for photos that I know I'm just gonna end up editing later anyway. And one more thing worth noting, the recipes usually have a dynamic range setting as well, which you can set to auto, 100%, 200%, or 400%. My understanding, and let me know if I'm missing something in the comments, is that for JPEGs, the higher the dynamic range setting, the more latitude your image will have between the highlights and shadows, and you should retain details in both pretty well. But most important, when it comes to editing the raw images, dynamic range set to 400 gives you a lot more room to work with when recovering those highlights and shadows in your editing software. So if you plan to edit after the fact, I highly recommend you set your dynamic range to 400% no matter what the recipe itself calls for. As I list my favorites in a second, I'll credit where I found them and who created the recipe, but just know that I may have adjusted a few things along the way to my own liking, most notably dynamic range, and the image examples that I show will reflect the changes that I made. In fact, to make it easy, I'll list the original recipe and then my own changes next to it in parentheses. Now that all that's out of the way, recipe number 1 is the one I just talked about a little bit that I keep stored in the nothing selected column. Dirty Pop is the name, and it's a name that fits quite well. It's one I saw Luis Chavez talk about in one of his videos, and I used it as created for the most part. However, I think he had the dynamic range set to 200, I boosted it to 400, and I also changed up the white balance a bit. Instead of +2 red and -1 blue, I pushed the tint a little warmer with -4 blue. I actually didn't stumble upon this recipe until using the camera for like 8 months, and I honestly wish I'd found it sooner. I love that it uses the Reala Ace simulation, which is a little punchier than the classic chrome base that so many other popular recipes use. And with the highlights and shadows boosted, there's a little more contrast that I enjoy in a lot of different scenarios. I took a lot of great photos in New York with this recipe. However, I ended up doing my own edits for all the ones I shared on social media and threads. And this is a great example of what you can get when you have the dynamic range set to 400 and edit the RAWs. These are some of my favorite photos that I've ever taken with the X100 VI, so I can't recommend Dirty Pop enough because it pops and it looks good and works well whether you're taking it straight out of camera or editing the RAWs. In fact, it's become pretty interchangeable with another everyday recipe I use a lot, Reggie's Portrait. And be sure to check out Reggie's channel for some even better examples of this recipe and overall a lot of great photography tips and topics. But yeah, Reggie's Portrait is another great all-arounder, especially for medium to darker skin tones. Now, what's great about those first two recipes is there's no adjustment to the clarity setting. A not so fun fact, if you adjust clarity up or down when you take a photo, it adds processing time for it being saved to the SD card, which slows down the shooting process quite a bit. You also can't shoot in bursts unless the clarity is set to 0. A lot of popular recipes call for the clarity to be reduced. When I'm editing photos, I tend to reduce the clarity as well to dial back some of that digital look. But I'm just not a fan of doing it in camera and the slow processing when I'm out and about shooting. So that's another change that I make in all of the recipes I use, no matter what they call for. It's always set to 0 for me, and instead I use a mist or glimmer glass filter on the lens to reduce clarity and bloom highlights a bit in camera. All right, back to the list. The next recipe is another favorite that's super versatile thanks to it using auto white balance, but it's also a little more stylized with added grain. Kodak Ultramax 400, which comes from Fuji X Weekly. It's one of the most used because, like the first two on the list, it works in a lot of different places. And especially if you want to add a bit of grain straight out of camera to give your image a little bit more of a filmic look, this does the trick. And with color boosted to +4, it gives you plenty of Fujifilm goodness, but doesn't overdo it, probably due to the subdued nature of the classic chrome simulation that it's based off of. Another one that I'm a huge fan of, also from Fuji X Weekly, is Portrait 800. And this is another one that I didn't start using until I'd had the camera for quite a while. But it is easily one of my favorite in just about any outdoor and sunny scenario. It's got a 6600 Kelvin white balance setting that gives a more natural looking warmth than a lot of the other recipes that instead get most of their warmth by tweaking the blue and red white balance tint. It's also another recipe that uses a strong and large grain setting, and again, I think it's a nice touch here. While Portrait 800 works great for sunny weather though, I do live in Portland, Oregon, and while it's not as bad as a lot of people make it out to be, there are a number of wet, dreary, gray days that I still want to shoot through. And that's where I turn to the Cloud Ultra recipe, which comes from Ross and his JPEGs. I'll link his website below. This one uses the Astia film simulation, which does a great job producing vibrant colors, but also not overdoing it, even with the color boosted to +4. This recipe also has a cool white balance around 6700 Kelvin, but I like to use it with auto white balance ambient priority and a slightly different tint of +3 red, -5 blue. I think that change in white balance makes it a little more versatile for taking pictures of people, pictures indoors in more difficult lighting, and even night photos. Some of my favorites came from a few Portland Timbers games where the field and the sky really popped even in overcast weather. Now, what those last three recipes all have in common is a strong and large grain pattern. And as much as I like that style, it can be a bit much sometimes, especially with pictures of people. If you shoot in RAW and JPEG, you can always go back to that RAW image and take the grain out should you choose to edit the photo instead. But for sharing those JPEGs straight out of camera, maybe you want something that's got those punchy colors, but not all that grain. For that, I really like this recipe based on the Provia film simulation. I came up with it myself and just call it Portland Summer because that's when I started using it more. I think because it's the standard simulation, it gets overlooked as everyone just jumps over to classic chrome right away. Similar to a lot of the more popular recipes, I added a bit of warmth to the white balance tint, which tends to make it easy to work with for both people and places, though you may want to dial things back a little bit in the shadows. Anyway, it's another one that's great all around and surprisingly good indoors. I think it comes in handy, especially when there's not much hard light to create contrast. Other flatter and more neutral recipes may not pop enough for your liking, but this one probably will. Finally, among the favorites and most used, a recipe that I've talked about in a video before based on the nostalgic negative simulation. I found it in an old Mike Chudley video, and it's another great all-arounder. I fell in love with this recipe on a trip to the Oregon coast where it was the only one I used over the course of 3 days. To my eye, it's pretty similar to Reggie's Portrait, as it gives a very pleasing look that's not too harsh and has some lifted shadows, but it just puts a hint of warmth on everything with the way that the nostalgic negative film simulation adds a bit of an amber tone. It does really well at sunset and doesn't overdo it with color when sunset is already a warm part of the day anyway, and overall it's just an easy recipe to use. For the honorable mentions, I wouldn't consider myself much of a black and white shooter yet, though I am actively working on it, but the Ilford HP5 Plus 400 recipe from Fuji X Weekly helps a lot if you just want something straight out of camera in black and white. The way I look at it, if you ever find yourself in some funky light, don't get frustrated, just try to keep a black and white recipe on deck and try it out, because you might like it a lot. Kodak Gold 200 was also a favorite of mine for the spring and most of the summer, but I've shifted away from using it quite as much, mainly because I like the warmth I get on sunny days from the Portrait 800 recipe a little bit more. And then two other quick mentions, Pacific Blues and Classic Cuban Negative, both based on the classic negative simulation. These are two recipes that when they hit and look amazing. Classic Cuban especially was like the recipe of the summer all over social media. Personally, I haven't been able to make it work for me though, and that's photography in a nutshell. A lot of it is just subjective, and despite how many sick photos I've seen with these recipes, it just isn't my style. And that's kind of an unintended result of using recipes. You start to find which ones you prefer and gravitate toward them. It's nice to have the ability to pull a 180 sometimes and completely change up the look of your photos and what you usually shoot if you want to, but if it's not your style, you probably won't. All that said though, before you plug these recipes in and start creating, a quick word of advice. It's not the film recipe alone that will make lasting images. And in many cases, it's not the film recipe that makes some of these images objectively good photos. I kind of think that recipes, as great as they are, do play a role in distracting us from what makes a great photo. Like when someone posts a great set of Fujifilm photos on social media, there's always a comment asking, "What's the recipe?" But instead, we should be looking at the lighting or composition, which play an even bigger role in crafting a good image. Hats off to all the creators who experiment with the colors and settings and then share these recipes for others to use. One of the best parts about the Fujifilm system as a whole is the community that's been built that's generally very positive and supportive with one another. The photos and recipes shared all over social media, from Facebook groups to Threads and Instagram to YouTube, they're awesome. But we've got to be wary of seeing a specific image with a specific recipe and thinking that just by plugging that recipe into our own camera, we're going to make a perfect image. Like if the recipe is used to make a photo of a gorgeous landscape or classic cityscape, don't expect it to perform miracles on a walk through an average neighborhood or at your local everyday coffee shop. Not to mention, there are just so many other factors that come into play with any photo, and you may not have the same tools to work with, be that a specific lens with a focal length or aperture that's unique to it, or again, lighting. Photography 101 tells you that lighting plays one of the biggest, if not the biggest role in the images we create. Even outdoors, the difference between photos taken in sunlight with lots of shadows and contrast and overcast weather with softer, even lighting and less punch is huge. Going indoors, lighting can really vary and make shooting conditions even tougher depending on the look you're going for. These are the kinds of things that no recipe can account for on its own, and where it's probably a good idea to have a few on deck, or at least know the settings to change within the recipe to make the kind of photos that you desire on the go. And I would bet that especially if you're taking photos of the precious moments in your life, when you look back at that photo, you won't care about the recipe. I'm heavily biased toward every photo taken of my own family for obvious reasons, and that's the final point I want to make with this video. The pictures we love are not always loved because of the camera we took them with, or because of the colors, or even the lighting. We love them because we love that moment. We should all be biased toward our own photos because they were captured in a special moment or serve as a way to express what we see. Pick a recipe I just showed, pick a black and white recipe, pick any recipe you find. Pick your own colors in your own edit. These settings and decisions we make with composition and color and light can elevate our images and make things stand out, sure, but ultimately enjoy that moment. And if you want to hang on to it forever, capture it whatever way makes you happy. Thanks as always for watching, guys. I hope this gave you some good recipes to try, and most important, I hope it gave you some inspiration to get out there and shoot, and I'll see you in the next video.